Imagine you have been stripped of everything. Your name is gone, replaced by a number tattooed into your skin. Your clothes are gone, your hair, your wedding ring, the manuscript you spent years writing. The people you love have been torn away from you in a train station, sorted with a casual flick of a finger toward the left or the right, toward labor or toward death, and you do not yet understand which line means which. You are cold, you are starving, you are worked to the edge of collapse, and every hour holds the ordinary possibility that this hour will be your last. In a place designed to erase not only your life, but your very humanity, what could possibly remain? What, if anything, could still be called yours? Viktor Frankl survived that place, and he came back with an answer that has quietly changed millions of lives. His answer was not that suffering is good, or that everything happens for a reason, or that you should simply think positive. His answer was stranger and more durable than any of that. He said that even when everything else has been taken from a person, one thing cannot be taken: the freedom to choose your attitude toward your circumstances, the freedom to decide what your suffering will mean, remains yours until your final breath. The book he wrote about this, Man's Search for Meaning, is barely the length of a long afternoon's reading, yet it has outlived the ideologies that tried to destroy him. Today we are going to walk through what he discovered, why it matters, and how a psychiatrist who watched an entire world collapse came to believe that the deepest human need is not pleasure and not power, but meaning. Viktor Emil Frankl was born in Vienna in 1905, into a city that was, in those years, the beating heart of a revolution in the human mind. Sigmund Freud lived and worked there, building his theory of psychoanalysis around the hidden power of the unconscious and the drive for pleasure. Alfred Adler worked there too, breaking from Freud to argue that the deeper human motive was a striving for significance and superiority, a will to power. The young Frankl grew up breathing this intellectual air. He corresponded with Freud as a teenager, and Freud, impressed, actually helped him publish an early paper. But Frankl came to feel that both of these giants had missed something. Human beings, he suspected, were driven by something the great Viennese schools had underestimated. Not the will to pleasure, and not the will to power, but the will to meaning. Frankl trained as a neurologist and psychiatrist, and even before the war he was already developing his own approach, which he would eventually call logotherapy, from the Greek word logos, meaning reason or meaning. In the 1930s, he worked with suicidal patients, and he ran counseling programs for young people that reportedly drove the youth suicide rate in Vienna sharply down. He was, in other words, already a man deeply preoccupied with the question of why people choose to keep living or choose not to. Then history arrived. When Nazi Germany annexed Austria in 1938, Frankl, as a Jew, watched his world begin to close in. He had an extraordinary stroke of what looked like luck. He obtained a visa to emigrate to the United States, a golden ticket out of the coming catastrophe. But his aging parents could not go with him, and he was torn. He tells a small story about how he made the decision. He came home one day and found a fragment of marble that his father had rescued from a Vienna synagogue that the Nazis had burned. On the fragment was part of a Hebrew engraving, and the surviving letters were from one of the 10 Commandments, the one instructing us to honor our father and our mother. Frankl took it as a sign. He let the visa lapse. He stayed. For that choice he paid an almost unimaginable price. In 1942 he, his wife, and his parents were deported. Over the next 3 years he passed through several camps, including Auschwitz and the Dachau network. His father died of starvation and illness. His mother was murdered in the gas chambers. His brother died in the camps. His young wife, Tilly, who was pregnant when they were separated, died in Bergen-Belsen. When Frankl was finally liberated in 1945, he emerged to discover that almost his entire family had been wiped out. He wrote the first part of his book in a matter of days after the war, an urgent outpouring, originally intending to publish it anonymously. What he produced was not a scream of despair, though he had every right to scream. It was a strange and luminous meditation on why some people survive the unsurvivable, and what that survival can teach the rest of us. The central claim of Frankl's whole life can be stated simply: The primary motivation of a human being is not to seek pleasure and not to seek power, but to find meaning in life. He called this the will to meaning, and he set it deliberately against Freud and Adler. Where Freud saw a creature governed by the pleasure principle, endlessly seeking gratification and avoiding pain, Frankl saw something that did not fit. He had watched people in the camps voluntarily give away their last piece of bread. He had watched men walk through the freezing barracks comforting others when they had no comfort left for themselves. That is not the behavior of a pleasure-seeking animal. That is the behavior of a creature reaching for something beyond itself. This reaching beyond the self was, for Frankl, the very definition of being human. He used the phrase self-transcendence to describe it. A human being, he argued, is not a closed system pursuing its own equilibrium. A human being points outward, toward a cause to serve, toward work to accomplish, toward another person to love. And here he made one of his most counterintuitive and important observations. The things we most desire, happiness, success, self-actualization, cannot be pursued directly. They can only ensue. They arrive as side effects of our dedication to something outside ourselves. The more you make happiness your target, the more surely you will miss it, because happiness is not a target at all. It is what happens to you while you are busy giving yourself to a meaning. Chase it directly and it flees. Forget yourself in service of a person or a cause, and it quietly appears at your side. This is why Frankl was so wary of the idea, common in his day and even more common in ours, that mental health means being free of tension, comfortable, satisfied, in balance. He argued the opposite. What a healthy human being needs is not a state of tensionless equilibrium, but the healthy tension of striving toward a goal worthy of them, a gap between who they are and who they could become, a task that calls to them and pulls them forward. He compared meaning to an object we reach for. If you want to strengthen someone, you do not remove all demands from their life. You give them something to reach for, some worthy load to carry. Meaning is that load, and carrying it is not a burden that crushes us, but the very thing that holds us upright. The first half of the book is Frankl's account of the camps, but he writes it as a psychiatrist as much as a survivor. He is not simply telling us what happened. He is observing, with an almost unbearable clarity, what happens to the human mind under total assault. And he identifies 3 phases that a prisoner passed through. The first phase was shock, beginning the moment of arrival. New prisoners clung to what Frankl called the delusion of reprieve, the desperate belief that surely, at the last second, they would be spared, that this could not really be happening. He describes the horror of arriving at Auschwitz and being sorted by a board officer whose pointing finger, left or right, decided who would live a little longer and who would be sent immediately to the gas chambers. 90% of the men on his transport were sent to their deaths within hours. The surviving prisoners were stripped of everything, including the manuscript Frankl had hidden in his coat, the life's work he had hoped to save. In that first phase, the mind reeled and could not comprehend. The second phase was apathy, a kind of emotional death that settled in as a defense. Once you have seen enough horror, Frankl observed, you stop reacting to it. A man being beaten, a corpse being dragged away, a friend collapsing, these things that would have shattered you on the first day became, after weeks, simply the texture of existence. The prisoner's inner life shrank to a hard, protective shell, and every scrap of energy was redirected toward one goal, the preservation of one's own life and the lives of a few close friends. Frankl does not present this apathy as a moral failing. He presents it as a necessary armor. And yet, and this is crucial, he insists that, even inside that armor, the human being was not fully determined by circumstance. Even in the depths of that emotional deadening, some prisoners chose to remain kind. The armor was real, but it was never total. The third phase came after liberation, and Frankl writes about it with unusual honesty. Freedom, when it finally arrived, did not feel the way the prisoners had dreamed. Many felt nothing at all, a kind of depersonalization, as if they were watching their own release from a great distance. Some, released into a world that had let this happen, became bitter and morally deformed, believing that because they had suffered without limit, they now had a right to do as they pleased. Frankl warns against this. Suffering, he insists, confers no license. The danger after great pain is not only despair. It is the temptation to let your pain excuse your cruelty. Out of all of this, Frankl drew the observation that became the moral center of his book, and perhaps the single most quoted idea he ever expressed. He noticed that the camps did something like a great and terrible experiment on the human soul. They took away everything external. And in doing so, they revealed what was internal. Some men, under identical conditions of starvation and terror, became like beasts. Others, under those same conditions, walked through the barracks giving away their bread and their comfort. If circumstances determined everything, this variation would be impossible. The same input would produce the same output. But it did not. And so Frankl concluded that between what happens to us and how we respond, there remains a space. And in that space lies our freedom and our power. Everything, he wrote, can be taken from a person but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, which is to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. This is the sentence that has traveled around the world. The guards could control his body, his food, his labor, whether he lived or died. But they could not reach into his mind and decide how he would bear it. They could not force him to become bitter or cruel or hopeless. That decision, however small it looked, remained his. And Frankl found that clinging to that inner decision was, quite literally, a matter of survival. The prisoners who let go of that inner freedom, who decided that nothing they did mattered anymore, tended to decline and die quickly. Those who held on to some inner citadel, some private determination about who they would be inside, endured. He tells one of the book's most piercing stories to illustrate this. On a brutal work detail, exhausted and freezing, stumbling through the dark, he forced his mind away from the misery of his body and fixed it instead on the image of his wife. He conjured her face, her smile, imagined talking with her. And in doing so, he made a discovery that he says came to him for the first time in his life. The salvation of a human being is through love and in love. A man who has nothing left in this world can still know bliss, if only for a moment, by contemplating the person he loves. It did not matter, in that moment, whether his wife was still alive. He did not know that she had already died. The love itself, held in his mind, was real and was enough. Love, he realized, reaches beyond the physical presence of the beloved. It reaches toward the spirit, the inner self, and it does not depend on whether the beloved is even still on this earth. If meaning is what we most deeply need, the obvious question is where we find it. And here Frankl is refreshingly concrete. He rejected the idea that the meaning of life is some grand abstraction, some single answer you could print on a poster. Meaning, he insisted, is always specific. It is the meaning of your life at this moment, in this situation, with these particular responsibilities in front of you. It changes from person to person and from hour to hour. So the real question is never what is the meaning of life in general, but what does this moment ask of me? And he mapped out 3 broad avenues through which meaning enters a human life. The first path is through creating a work or doing a deed. This is meaning through action, through what we give to the world. It is the meaning found in your work when your work genuinely matters to you, in a project you pour yourself into, in a task that only you can do. It is the writer writing, the parent raising, the builder building, the healer healing. Through what we create and accomplish, we leave the mark of our meaning on the world. The second path is through experiencing something or encountering someone. This is meaning received rather than given, the meaning that comes through beauty, through nature, through art, through truth, and above all through love. To love another person, to know them in their absolute uniqueness, to see the potential in them and help call it forth, is one of the highest ways a human being can experience meaning. When Frankl held the image of his wife in the freezing dark, he was walking this second path. Meaning was flowing into him through love, even in a place designed to extinguish it. The third path is the one that makes Frankl unlike almost anyone else, and it is the path through suffering. He argued that even in a hopeless situation, even when we face a fate we cannot change, we can still find meaning, because we can choose the attitude we take toward unavoidable suffering. This is the meaning of the courageous patient, the dignified mourner, the person who bears an incurable illness without becoming small or bitter. Frankl is careful here, and this care is important. He is not glorifying suffering. He explicitly says that if a suffering can be removed, if its cause can be fixed, then the meaningful thing to do is to remove it. To seek out suffering needlessly is not heroism, it is masochism. The third path applies only to suffering that is genuinely unavoidable, the kind that comes to every human life sooner or later and cannot be escaped. And his radical claim is that even there, especially there, we are not helpless. When we can no longer change our situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. The way a person bears an unavoidable fate, the dignity or the collapse, becomes their final achievement, a meaning that suffering itself cannot take away. Frankl did not stop with the camps. When he returned to his work as a psychiatrist in the second half of the 20th century, he began to notice a new kind of suffering, one that had nothing to do with barbed wire or starvation. His patients, many of them comfortable, safe, and materially secure, were coming to him with a complaint he found harder to treat than any physical ailment. They felt that their lives were empty. They felt that nothing meant anything. He called this condition the existential vacuum, and he believed it was becoming the defining sickness of the modern age. He described its symptoms with great insight. There is the boredom that seizes people the moment their busyness stops, what he called the Sunday neurosis, the low dread that descends when the working week ends and a person is left alone with the silence of their own life and the sudden question of what any of it is for. There is the way people rush to fill this vacuum with substitutes, with the pursuit of pleasure, with the pursuit of money and power, with conformity, doing what everyone else does, or with obedience, doing what others tell them to do. Precisely because they cannot hear any inner voice telling them what they themselves want. Frankl traced this vacuum to a peculiar feature of the human condition. Unlike animals, we are not driven by instinct telling us exactly what to do. And unlike people in earlier centuries, we can no longer rely on tradition telling us what we ought to do. The old certainties have loosened. And so the modern person stands in a strange freedom, with no instinct and no tradition to lean on, and often does not know what they truly want at all. This is not, in Frankl's view, a reason for despair. It is the arena of our responsibility. The absence of a given answer is exactly what makes our search for meaning our own. But he warned, with something close to prophecy, that a civilization that gives people every comfort and no meaning is building a machine for depression, addiction, and quiet despair. Prosperity without purpose is its own kind of camp. Frankl was not only a philosopher of meaning. He was a working clinician, and he developed practical techniques that grew directly out of his ideas, techniques still used and studied today. Two of them are worth understanding because they reveal the strange wisdom at the heart of his method. The first is called paradoxical intention. Frankl noticed that many fears and compulsions feed on themselves. A person afraid of blushing blushes more because they fear it. A person desperate to fall asleep cannot sleep precisely because they are trying so hard. The fear of the symptom produces the symptom, which deepens the fear, a vicious spiral. His solution was audacious. He told patients to wish for the very thing they dreaded. The man afraid of sweating in public was told to try, deliberately, to sweat as much as humanly possible, to show everyone just how much he could sweat. The absurdity of the instruction broke the spiral. You cannot force yourself to be terrified of something while you are cheerfully trying to make it happen. The fear, deprived of its fuel, dissolved. This technique reveals Frankl's deep understanding that our attempts to control our inner states can trap us, and that sometimes the way out is to stop fighting and turn the fear into a joke. The second technique is called dereflection, and it flows from his idea of self-transcendence. Frankl observed that many people are trapped by too much attention to themselves, an excessive self-monitoring he called hyperreflection. The person obsessed with whether they are happy cannot be happy. The person constantly checking whether they are performing well in some intimate or creative act sabotages the very thing they are watching. His remedy was to turn attention outward, away from the self and toward the world, toward the task, toward the other person. Stop watching yourself, he was saying, and give yourself to what is in front of you. This is the practical face of his whole philosophy. Self-absorption is a prison. The door out of it is to forget yourself in devotion to something beyond yourself. The cure for excessive inwardness is genuine outwardness. In a later essay that Frankl added to the book, he gave a name to the stance his whole life had been building toward. He called it tragic optimism. It is one of the most honest ideas in the book because it refuses the easy comforts of ordinary optimism. Frankl was not a cheerful man telling you that everything will be fine. He had buried that illusion in the camps along with his family. Tragic optimism means saying yes to life in spite of everything, in spite of what he called the tragic triad, the three unavoidable features of human existence: pain, guilt, and death. Pain, because suffering comes to everyone. Guilt, because we all fall short and make choices we cannot undo. Death, because our time is finite and running out. The tragic optimist does not deny any of these. Instead, they ask how a person can still say yes to life while looking these three facts full in the face. And Frankl's answer is that each of them, rather than defeating meaning, can become an occasion for it. Suffering, faced with dignity, can be transformed into a human achievement. Guilt can give us the opportunity to change ourselves for the better, to take responsibility and to grow. And death, the finitude of our lives, far from making everything pointless, is precisely what gives our choices weight. If we lived forever, we could postpone everything indefinitely, forever putting off what matters. It is because our time is limited that each moment demands something of us now. The clock ticking is not our enemy. It is what makes our lives real. Frankl offered a beautiful image for how to relate to time. Most people, he said, look at the field of time and see only the stubble of what is already past, mourning what is gone. But the truly wise person looks instead at the full granaries of the past, at everything they have already lived, loved, suffered, and accomplished, all of it safely stored away where nothing and no one can ever take it. Nothing that has truly been can ever be undone. What we have done, whom we have loved, how we have borne our pain, all of it is preserved forever in the past, the one form of existence that is absolutely secure. To have been is the surest kind of being there is. So, what do we carry away from this small, world-changing book? Let me gather the essential threads. The first takeaway is that meaning, not pleasure or power, is the deepest human motivation, and that a life organized around meaning is more resilient than a life organized around comfort. When you have a strong enough reason to live, a why, you can bear almost anyhow. Frankl saw this proven in the most extreme laboratory imaginable. The prisoners who had something waiting for them, a book to finish, a child to find, a task only they could complete, were the ones most likely to survive. The second takeaway is that meaning is found, not invented, and it is always concrete and specific. Do not ask what the meaning of life is in the abstract. Frankl urged a complete reversal of the question. Stop asking what you expect from life and understand instead that life is asking something of you. Every situation you face is a question that life is putting to you, and your life is your answer. Meaning is not a grand theory you figure out once. It is a summons you respond to, freshly, in each new moment. The third takeaway is that we are free, always, in the one place that matters most. Circumstances may take everything from us except the freedom to choose our response. Between stimulus and response there is a space, and in that space lies our growth and our dignity. No tyrant, no illness, no misfortune can reach across that space and make the choice for us. This is not a naive denial of how much external forces shape our lives. It is a stubborn insistence that they never shape us completely. The fourth takeaway is that suffering, when it cannot be avoided, need not be meaningless. We cannot always choose what happens to us, but we can choose who we become in response. The way we bear an unavoidable fate can be our final and greatest achievement. This is not a call to seek out pain, but a promise that even pain we did not choose can be transformed by the spirit in which we carry it. And the fifth takeaway is that the way toward meaning leads outward, not inward. Happiness and self-fulfillment cannot be chased directly. They come as side effects of self-transcendence, of forgetting yourself in devotion to a cause you serve or a person you love. The more you aim at yourself, the more you miss. Give yourself away to something larger, and you find yourself. Viktor Frankl proposed, near the end of his life, that the Statue of Liberty on the eastern shore of the United States should be balanced by a statue of responsibility on the western shore. It captures the whole of his message in a single image. Freedom, he believed, is only half the truth, and the more dangerous half if it stands alone. Freedom without responsibility degenerates into mere arbitrariness. We are free, yes, but we are free for something, answerable to the meanings that call to us and the people who need us. The last human freedom is not the freedom to do whatever we please. It is the freedom to answer, with our whole lives, the question that life is always asking us. There is something almost unbearable about the authority behind these words. Many people have written about hope. Very few have earned the right to as completely as Frankl did. He watched his wife, his mother, his father, his brother, and his unborn child swallowed by the machinery of one of history's darkest chapters. He lost his manuscript, his freedom, his name, his health. And he came out the other side, not broken, not vengeful, but carrying a message about the indestructibility of the human spirit that he then spent the next 50 years of his life sharing with the world. He lived to be 92. He kept seeing patients, kept lecturing, and famously learned to fly a plane in his late 60s. The lasting gift of man's search for meaning is not a formula. Frankl never tells you what your meaning is, because he insists that only you can discover it in the particular shape of your own life, your own work, your own loves, and your own unavoidable sorrows. What he offers instead is a kind of permission and a kind of challenge. The permission is to believe that your life can hold meaning no matter what happens to you, that no circumstance is so dark that meaning cannot be found within it. The challenge is to stop waiting for life to satisfy you and to start asking what life is asking of you. Live, Frankl suggests, as though you were living for the second time, and as though you had acted the first time as wrongly as you are about to act now. Feel the weight of that. It means every choice is a chance to get it right, and the fact that you get only one pass through this moment is exactly what makes the moment matter. That is not a burden. In Frankl's hands, it is the very thing that makes a human life worth living.